Okay, folks, we are now underway. We are live. Thanks again for joining me and Happy New Year. This is and thank goodness, finally, round 20 of the Farmland Protection Implementation Grants has been announced. As you probably are aware, it was announced just before Christmas. And it will continue with record level funding of $67 million, which includes $50 million from the Bond Act. It will continue really until the money runs out. And I'm anticipating that probably not much of anything will change until about, I think it's next April 1st, I think we are shooting for. There could be a sea change coming then. It really depends on the level of activity of submitted applications and how many have been deemed to be award worthy by that time. But I'll get into that a little bit more later on. But that's a date you might want to keep in mind and pay attention on the status updates, which I'll also try and show you at some point here in this presentation, where you can find those on the department's website. So you can have a pretty accurate estimate of the current status of things, submitted applications, as well as applications that have been deemed award worthy. Again, thanks for joining. And let's get underway here as soon as I can get my screen a little bit uncluttered. Bear with me here. Okay, this is going to be pretty close outline, I think, of what we're going to get through today. And I did want to notice the thing I flagged in red down below. I noticed that I did not update this. There's many changes where we're waiting for this to grant opportunity to be announced. The questions are actually going to be due, next Monday, a week from today. So give you a chance to hear or listen, participate, whatever, in both webinars, as well as hopefully have an opportunity to at least peruse the RFA, or request for applications document. If not, read it closely. I would encourage you to do that. And submit whatever questions you feel that you have. Today, feel free to ask questions, as we go along, as I unmute things at times. I'll be happy to hear your question. I may or may not answer it today. It really depends on the nature of the question. If it's a question that I feel like it hasn't been already addressed in the RFA, then I'll ask you to put it in writing and submit it to us so we can provide an answer and then get that posted for everyone on everyone's benefit on the department's website. Otherwise, if there's other things that you asked today, if I can just direct you to a part of the RFA document itself, I'll do that. So please feel free to fire away with questions when we get to that. Nothing else. You can see that I have a period of time near the end of the presentation. We'll definitely take whatever questions you have, but hopefully we'll have time to get through that as well. So those are dates to keep in mind. Next Monday, if you have any questions, submit those in writing. And then what we'll do is try and get them posted the following week on the department's website. So who are the eligible applicants for this request for applications? As it has been for quite a few years now with the FPIG program, it can be a county, it can be any municipality with an acceptable local plan. That term's highlighted, a little definition shown down below. If any of you municipalities are interested or thinking about applying, particularly if you've never done so in the history of the program, my best advice to you is reach out to me directly before you submit an application, and let's talk about your plan just to make sure that it's acceptable to the department. If it pretty much meets the criteria, the content mentioned down below, everything will be just fine. And really can't count on something that might be underway. It really has to be an approved plan. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to just reach out to me. And I do want to say this for all of you, the benefit, but especially those of you who may not be that familiar with the FPIG program, particularly when we're offering it as a request for applications. The RFA is really important for all of you to be aware of because it's an open process. At any time, any of you can ask me any question. You can contact me. We can set up individual webinar, video conference to discuss things. You can submit a site plan before you actually submit the application. If you'd like me to review it, just to make sure that we're not going to have any issues with it. All of that is possible. All of that, frankly, is encouraged by me for all of you to take advantage of. And that's what I think is the real advantage of a request for applications, as opposed to what we used to do routinely, a request for proposals, an RFP, which is a highly competitive process, and one that, other than a webinar, that would be my only opportunity to speak with any of you during the duration of that. I'm basically prohibited from having any conversations with anyone. And then you submit your application, hope for the best, and then find out what the result was after the application period is ended. So we have an open application period, which means that, again, it'll stay open until we basically award the 67 million. And at any time, you can reach out with questions, queries, even if you're kind of pondering, is this the right type of property for this program? All those things are worthwhile things to talk about, especially before you go through the energy and time of putting together a full formal application. So please take me up on that invitation. What are the eligible projects? Well, in a nutshell, if it's going to result in a perpetual agricultural conservation easement, that's what we're looking to fund, quite simply. What I always like to remind people is that if you have completed a project in the past, and frankly, whether or not you've ever received FPIG funding to do that prior project, you can always consider amending an existing agricultural conservation easement, probably to add more acreage. That would be key for FPIG. But if you were thinking about doing that, don't forget that we also accept projects where you may be amending an existing easement by adding more acreage, and we can award those types of projects. And I had discussed a situation just like that with someone who has subsequently submitted an application in this round. I haven't yet looked at it, but I'm quite optimistic that it's going to work out fine. So please keep that in mind. And so when you see a prohibition on we can't, fund a project with an easement that's already in place, keep in mind that the added acres are unprotected, and that's kind of our workaround, if you will. So keep that aspect in mind as well. But basically, again, if we're going to be helping you purchase an agricultural conservation easement, that's what we fund. We do not fund the purchase of development rights. Now, I know that that phrase is quite often used when we're actually talking about a purchase of agricultural conservation easement, but really they're two different things. And for those of you who have ever worked on or are aware of the activities of farmland protection and open space preservation on Long Island, that's routinely what they do almost exclusively, is actually purchase development rights. But it really legally is a different animal. And we've made the decision we're not going to provide funding for those. So moving on. There we go. Get back to this. For the determining eligibility, that's what these yellow things are highlighting. It really is, again, if none of you have participated or some of you have not, these would be the key things to keep in mind that are really going to be scrutinized in the application. The online application questions really get to the heart of many of these issues that are listed here in yellow. The ones that are grayed out, we're actually going to be talking about in tomorrow's presentation. We get into a little bit more of the weeds there on that. But for the most part, these are pretty straightforward. We're looking for acreages numbers. You have to exceed whatever the stipulated minimum is. We're looking for percent extent, whether it's active agriculture or high quality soils. Again, you'd have to meet or exceed whatever the stipulated minimum is. And with the agricultural production, sometimes that can vary by category, which is why we're going to touch on that again tomorrow. And the same would be with soils. We typically and historically, our program has focused really unapologetically on prime soils and soils of statewide importance. But going into the RFA approach with multiple categories, we've also really embraced for some categories, not all, unique soils. And that's particularly important for some of the unique crops that are grown, onions on black dirt, for example, or even orchards, apple orchards on hillsides, whatever. Oftentimes, they're going to have unique soils to keep in mind. So particularly since I've been here for 21 years, I've heard some folks criticize us in years past. We have been embracing this now for the last 2, 3 rounds, this idea of unique soils. So please keep that in mind if that's relevant for your particular project. Site plan is always critically important. The department puts a great deal of emphasis on that aspect because we believe that that's fundamentally associated with the viability of any farm operation, regardless of its size and scale and type and its location in the landscape. But it's for all those reasons why we scrutinize that a great deal. A relatively new component, which was introduced, I think, a round or two ago, is looking at having a requirement to fill out a form just to indicate of what degree of participation is the landowner involved in with really conservation planning. And we're obviously looking at agricultural resources. So the Agriculture Environmental Management Program, which is also administered elsewhere in our division at our agency through the state soil conservation folks. That is the principal emphasis is AIM, but it can be or an equivalent. So if any of you or your farmers are more familiar with working routinely with the Natural Resource Conservation Service of USDA, they have a very comparable type of program. If by chance any of you are in the watershed of New York City, been working with the Watershed Ag Council, oftentimes, they're going to be paying much more attractive 100% rather than us up to 87.5%. But if by chance you have a plan done through them, that's I'm quite certain going to be acceptable as well. And so we look at a variety of different types of sources of plans, but they really do have to address the agricultural activities and some acres that are going to be protected. Moving on, the selection of an easement is really important because of its policy content. And so a number of years, I think it's about 12 years ago, we came up with the idea that we have 3 tiers of cost share, and you have to select one as part of the application because that will obviously affect whatever the content is of the easement that you must attach a copy of, as well as the budget. And so our cost share rates vary from a high of 87.5%. And please keep in mind, I'm expecting you to submit a budget that reflects a state contribution of exactly 87.5% of total project costs. The only time it would be less than that is that if you're hitting your head against the award cap, which has now been established at $3 million. Please please note that that's a 50% increase. So the award cap is now $3 million for an individual project. But unless you're flirting with that or have exceeded that amount in total project costs, that would be the only way that you would not be asking for 87.5%. And that cost share rate requires use of the department's easement. There's no negotiation about that, and there's no negotiation about terms within the easement. You simply fill out the blanks and use that throughout the project, assuming it gets awarded. The second cost share rate, and I'll get into this again a little bit later with some of the distinctions, is up to 75%. The important thing is that that's where the entity that's applying, you're free to use your own easement. You're not obligated to use the department's model easement. But when you do so, you must incorporate some provisions that we require to be inserted into your document. And that is also with the, the provisos that are listed here, that there's no reference within your easement to Section 247 of New York State General Municipal Law. That's probably only going to come up if the applicant or the grantee is a municipality. Oftentimes you folks do like to reference that. We have a strong preference not to do so, because within that, inherently within that statutory reference, it's only talking about lands that are in modified agricultural production. In other words, there's really no accommodation or really allowance for you to be looking at farmstead areas, other types of building envelopes. So that's why we prohibit the reference to that, because everyone can use the standard reference to the New York State statute in environmental conservation law for conservation easements. And that's the one we would expect everyone to rely on. Also, you cannot unreasonably restrict within the easement document or otherwise regulate farm operations. That would be really in contravention of the purposes of Article 25AA of Ag and Markets Law. And Article 25AA is really agricultural districts program. And one of the things that our agency actually helps defend farmers from are unreasonable local laws that end up in zoning, subdivision, site planning requirements, those types of things. So we certainly wouldn't be funding a project that we would allow you to then do that through the easement. And the other thing we'll take a close look at is the purpose section, as well as the implementation provisions. And finally, we get to the third cost share rate, which really, to cut to the chase, you must have or you must obtain a federal farmland protection grant. Otherwise, you can't select that cost share rate. But we do allow you to apply without a federal award. In doing so, you must realize that for the end of the contract that would be eventually awarded, you must get a federal grant award. And I'll get into the details of some of the other nuances between these three just a little bit later on. But again, with the third cost share rate, like the second one, you could use your entity's easement, and really what you'll be negotiating will be with the federal government, not with us. We'll pretty much accept whatever you two come up with. I will be looking to see if there's any unreasonable restrictions. The last part of the eligibility that we really take a close look at is this, again, making sure that the match, if you are selecting the up to 75%, the second cost share tier, or the third one, the 25% plus, making sure that, the match requirements are met. Where's this money coming from? Just making sure it's not another state source, that kind of thing. And then obviously, whatever the questions are on the online application in SFS, the statewide financial system, all that has to be completed and have to be acceptable responses. That's what really determines the overall eligibility. The good news is that when you submit something, if I do have comments, you're not going to be deemed disqualified. You're not going to be deemed ineligible. I will provide comments to you about things that need to be addressed, things that need to be clarified. And whenever you respond, I will look at those. And then if that makes it deemed award worthy, I will then let you know that. And that's the benefit really of an RFA process. You're not submit once and done and hope for the best. We can have some back and forth if that becomes necessary. And as long as you can stay engaged and provide me the information I'm looking for, that's a way to get to that certainty of getting award worthy. Preemptive purchase right is an important element, particularly for those of you that are in parts of the state where there's a lot of development activity, and I'm talking about non-farm conversion or a non-farm type of development, conversion of farmland, agricultural lands to other uses. Usually then it's a good idea to at least think about seriously incorporating a preemptive purchase right into the agricultural conservation easement. And while the provision is quite complicated, we don't even offer a template of one. We want to review yours, but there are some entities around that have done these. If you are wondering about that or want to find out more, feel free just to send me an email, and I can provide you a couple of suggested folks to talk to about that. But A preemptive purchase right is an eligible expense, and we do have some caps on the state contribution, and we also have some required prerequisites. There must be at least 25% of the easement um, must be atop of prime soils. And that's an important stipulation. We do have a waiver to that, which I'll get into tomorrow, but it's only for one category and unique situation. So keep in mind that the high quality soils have to be there in order to justify the state spending additional money, because incorporating a PPR will add to the cost of acquiring the easement. You're basically further limiting the number of potential buyers of the property because they have to be farmers. The only exception is if the current owner is choosing to sell or otherwise gift the property to another family member. And that person doesn't have to be a farmer, but that's the only exception. Otherwise, anytime it's moving to a different owner, that owner must be a farmer, and there must be proof of that. So that's the significance of that provision. But it's one that I think has its place. We probably would not encourage it to be used on every single transaction, but it certainly has its place in a number of areas throughout the state, and we would really encourage you to seriously consider incorporating it into your project. Um, the cash match, which I'll touch on a little bit later, is important, particularly if you select the either the latter two cost share tiers, the up to 75%, up in the 25% plus. And if you're going to do PPR with state money, that's the important caveat, then you must use the qualified farmer definition that you will incorporate into that provision. And because there's a little bit of a exception to that, I'll get into that again tomorrow. And it applies really only to the food security category. Now this is hopelessly tiny font, so I'm going to expand the screen in just a moment. But I wanted to give you kind of the first ideas that, and this table exists in the RFA document itself. But I want to go into a little bit of the detail here so you can start getting a little bit more appreciation between the nuances between the three categories. The big one, of course, is the difference in percentage of state contribution towards total project costs, and also which easement or whose easement must or can you use. Those are obviously important determinations, I would hope, for both the entity applying as well as the landowner. But there's a couple other things associated with that I want to show you. So first of all, I'm going to talk about this green grouping across here, and this is the 87.5% cost share rate. That'll talk about the middle kind of bluish one, that up to 75%, and lastly touch on the 25% plus, and I'll explain what I mean by that plus. That's the one that involves the federal grant. So let's expand this a bit here first. I'll try and keep the headers as much as possible. Again, please keep in mind we've increased the maximum state award to $3 million. It was previously $2 million. So with that in mind, and the amounts that we limit the awards to does vary with the cost share rates. But $3 million is available for up to 87.5%, or at 87.5, I should say. And when you're looking at the caps within that contribution, PPR is one that we just talked about, the preemptive purchase right. We will limit our contribution to 40% of the value of agricultural conservation easement. That's less the PPR component, or $250,000, whichever is less. So another way of thinking about this is that if the total easement cost, just the cost of the easement itself, is the sum of the value development rights, if you want to phrase it that way, or the potential for development, and then add in, well, what would be the additional cost of PPR? The sum total then is the true cost of that easement. So what I'm saying is that we would limit the contribution of state money towards PPR to 40% of that value, or 250,000 again, whichever is less. And I think the way to do that, I'll show it a little bit better later on here in looking at the examples of each of these three tiers. I'll show you a financial worksheet. And so try and keep a hold of questions, the Len or former questions when we go into that. Maybe I can address them at that time. But those will be an important one. That 250,000 is likely to be it to keep in mind. The other aspect is that we have long time have had a cap of $10,000 per easement for easement stewardship fee, but this is the second or third round now that we've offered an additional alternative to that 10,000 per easement cap, and you must provide a copy of your entity's easement stewardship policy that's been adopted by your board, and within that there must be enough detail to stipulate how would you go about really determining an annual cost for which you want a contribution to be applied towards. So if you don't have that kind of detail, don't have that type of policy, you would not be able to ask for that kind of additional amount. But that could be substantially greater than 10,000 per easement. So that's why it may be worth your while to explore that. Now, if you do have a policy and you want to explore that with me before you apply, I would be welcome, would welcome that kind of inquiry and be happy to help sort that out and help you with that. The last round, I think we had one entity that took advantage of that. And again, this is on a per easement basis. So you could potentially have a project for whatever reason that might be multiple easements, and you might only choose to do the easement, the alternative stewardship fee on one of them. Again, I don't know why, but you'd have that kind of flexibility of building your budget. Otherwise, the simplistic thing is if you have 5 easements, you can ask for up to $50,000, 10,000 per easement. So then the minimum local contribution is 12.5% of total project costs if we're giving 87.5. And keep in mind that must come solely from the landowner. And why that's the case, it's right out of our statute, which is 25 AAA Ag and Markets Law. And the legislature, the New York State legislature, determined that we would provide no more than 87.5%. And in doing so, they also determined that the landowner would exclusively provide the difference. So the significance of that is, and my best coaching to you all, is that simply have the landowner contribution be the equivalent of the bargain sale donation. In other words, if the easement has a market value of $1 million, and we can only at most pay him 87.5% of that, then the 12.5% difference, the bargain sale donation that the person's making, the opportunity cost, if you will, of selling that easement at 12.5 cents on the dollar, that would be shown as a landowner contribution, and that is an eligible match. Even though there's really no money on the table per se, it's an opportunity cost that we recognize as an eligible match. So that would be the way to do that, rather than having the landowner pay for any out-of-pocket cash expense towards any transaction costs. That doesn't really make any sense to have the person do that. So that's why we say there's no cash required to be provided as part of that local match. And again, the easement requirement is he must use the department's easement template. So if we go then into the second cost share tier, this is up to 75% of total project costs. Again, still cap of $3 million. This is where for entities that feel strongly you want to use your easement, and that makes a great deal of sense. It's your project. You can do so as the easement requirement, but look at the couple of stipulations that have been added to that. You'd have to use the department's required agricultural conservation easement provisions, basically as is, you insert them. Also make sure that there's no provision elsewhere in your document that we would find to be unreasonably restrictive or regulating the farm operation. And that'll be solely our call, and we'll review things. The most colorful and strange, in my opinion, example that we've ever seen that was the most extreme example of this as an easement that was proposed once actually had said that the color of the barn must be oxblood red with white trim on the windows, and the shingles on the roof must be the same color gray as shag bark hickory. We thought that that was an unreasonable restriction, would never allow that to happen. Now, that's probably the most extreme case, but you can have other things that would be far more subtle that we might find to be an unreasonable restriction. If you have any questions about that or are wondering about that, feel free to just send me your document or the provision. We can talk about it and I can let you know. But those would be the kinds of things that would be part of that review of that easement component that's in your application at the time you apply. Again, particularly if you're a municipality, your easement cannot make reference to Section 247 of New York State General Municipal Law. And then finally, we would be doing a close read and review of the purpose section of your easement as well as the implementation provisions, because they must be consistent with what is in our required document easement provisions that we're providing to you. So going back to the left side of the table, up to 75% of total project costs. Again, we do allow PPR to be included, have the same caps, 40% of that total value or 250,000, whichever is less. Easement stewardship fee, again, 10,000 per easement, or that alternative approach if there's a policy, if there's adequate detail to provide a calculation of what would that annualized cost be, and then therefore how much are you asking for easement stewardship. All that is the same as the first tier. The middle column is reflecting then, okay, then obviously that leaves then a minimum of 25% of total project costs that have to be provided through some, what I'm calling in air quotes, local contribution. A local contribution means that it cannot be derived from any state source. In this case, it also can't be derived from any federal source because that's the next cost share rate. So if you are a land trust that are submitting the application and you have the ability to tap into county funds, municipality funds, maybe a community foundation, maybe a charitable individual who's providing some cash, maybe you do your own fundraising activity. Just keep in mind that if you, especially at that latter point, you've decided you're going to carry on a local fundraising campaign, that you will be on the hook for whatever that amount of cash is that you're saying. So just be mindful of those things. We can't give you a waiver after the fact if you don't hit those targets. That is a reason why you were given the award if you choose to go down that kind of a path. What we also don't allow you to do, moving into the next column, is that you got to provide at least 5% of that local match contribution in cash, and you can't put all of that burden on the landowner. That would be inherently unfair because it would be much better for the landowner to say, well, let's go with the 87.5% route. If I'm going to have to give a contribution, why not get more cash from the state? So we say that you have to bring some cash to the table, whether it's the entity itself or it's from another local source. Any of that's allowed. You just can't have all 5,000 come from the landowner. And if you were going to do a PPR at the 75% cost share rate, a really important thing to keep in mind is that that $5,000 cash contribution has an additional requirement, is that you must make the landowner whole on the true cost of the PPR itself. That becomes important if our contribution is tapped out at 250,000 or 40% of the cost of the easement, because then you're going to have to make up the difference, and that might be 60% of the cost of the PPR. And so get a good idea of, as best you can, of what those costs might be. And keep in mind that as you move forward and then the appraisal is actually done, if you don't have one, if you're not going to do one up front, the appraisal would reveal what those costs are. And again, you don't really have any latitude to get more money from us after the fact. Sometimes we do allow for a unanticipated cost increase. And certainly if the appraisal was much higher than you thought, that would be an allowable change, but it's also increasing the landowner's contribution likely. And so that's the kind of thing that you need to be mindful of, is that they may not be willing to go there, even if the state is adding more money, because it's also a greater financial burden on them. And that may be something that they find unacceptable. So you'll have to have those kind of frank conversations up front, get them prepared mentally of what might come, and then see what happens as you proceed. It really is about local project management. And as I've told many of you that have done these projects in the past, I know and I very much understand probably the hardest job that you have is managing landowner expectations. And frankly, folks, that begins with your first conversations with the landowner about even thinking about applying for a grant, because that's really where a lot of their expectations are going to become set in their mind. You promised this much money. You said this. They don't forget those things. And so I'll do my best to help you explain to them as things change if we do award the project. But these are the kinds of things to try and frame out with the landowner, so they go into this with their eyes wide open and some realistic expectations of just how variable things can become, because we're all doing this based on estimates. None of these things are known at this moment in time. So then lastly, we move into um, the 25% cost, 25% plus, excuse me. And this is the cost share rate that requires a federal farmland protection award. Now, typically that would probably come through the NRCS, the Natural Conservation Service, probably through the agricultural, and what am I saying? The ASEP program, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. There we go. Or it potentially maybe could come from, particularly if it's with the Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust, Tug Hill Plateau area with Fort Drum. But as that entity knows, there's really a different state funding that's now available through DEC for that. So we would probably frown on that here, given our history with that past program as well. But if there's any other federal funding source that that may come up uniquely from time to time, certainly explore that with me, and I'll find out if that's something we find acceptable. But anything associated with the ASEP program would clearly be eligible. And so historically, what the feds have done is they provide up to 50% of the cost of the easement. We would add 25% towards that, so that would become 75% of the value of the easement would be covered for the landowner. And then we would pick up, because historically, and I know that's changed recently, but historically the feds never picked up the transaction costs. We would be happy to pick up all of them. And so that's where the plus is really making reference to. We would cover all transaction costs if you do go down the path of the federal award, this 25% plus cost share rate. Please note a few important things. One is we put a cap on the state contribution of $500,000, nothing close to $3 million. Secondly, this cost share rate is not available for all 11 categories that we fund under FPIG. Food security, climate resiliency, source water protection categories, they're not available for federal funding assistance. Keep in mind also that you don't have to have the federal award in hand, so to speak, an award letter, but you are going to have to get an award from that federal source at some point during the FPIG contract period, which runs about 4 years, and it would begin day one of that period would be the date of the award letter that you receive from us when we fund it. So you would have from that moment on 4 years. You could also have an award in hand already when you apply, or getting maybe an award you anticipate, and you get it shortly after submitting to us. Any of those kind of scenarios would be possible, and we would find those acceptable. Again, the content of the easement is likely going to be determined between your entity and the federal government. My review of the document would be basically looking to make sure that the purpose at least says something about reserving for agricultural use. And then I would also be looking to see if there's any unreasonable restrictions. In the past, a good example of that was when the federal government used to require pretty routinely that haylands could not be harvested until like about August, which is really kind of crazy from a farm viability and an economic standpoint, because the best hay is grown before then, and the best value in hay to as a feed source and other things occurs before then. So we would never support across the board, and probably not even on an individual field basis, that kind of stipulation. But depending on the situation, if it's a larger farm and if there was a field that was had that type of restriction, we might be favorable to allow that to happen. But it would be better if it was on really marginal agricultural lands to begin with. Nothing that would be prime soils, nothing that would be soils of statewide importance. But that's really kind of splitting hairs at that point. But I'd be willing to explore that if it's on a limited basis of the overall easement area. Again, tomorrow we'll get into a little bit more details about some of these caps and other things related to particularly food security again. Now what I want to do is expand this back out and continue on. Our 67 million is basically allocated equally to 9 of the 10 economic regions. New York City down here is not colored in. We do not have an allocation to them. Instead, we're going to reserve that 10th share, if you will, $6.365 million. We're going to hold that in reserve, and that is what will become available, as noted here, after June 1st. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to happen on June 1st. It doesn't even necessarily mean it's going to happen on June 2nd. It's just that it won't happen any sooner than June 1st. And keep in mind that given that this opportunity was finally announced in late December, we had initially anticipated this to have occurred back in May. So the many months delay might affect that June 1st. But on the other hand, if people start really increasing the activity of submitting applications, and we find those across the board to be basically all award worthy, then we might be knocking on that door by June 1st of thinking that, well, we're nearing the end of the availability of funds, so there's really no reason to sit on that 6.3 million any longer. And I'll touch a little bit more about that reserved amount and really how that plays into things and how that could be potentially available to any of you, anywhere in the state, in any region. But keep in mind that each of the 9 colored areas here have a $6.365 million allocation that is for their exclusive use initially. And so by the date, if it's June 1st or any date thereafter, then the regional boundaries will disappear, and any amount of that 6.3 plus million that was unawarded by that time will then be added to the reserved amount. And then we will simply begin funding on a waiting list, which I'll also explain just a little bit from now. That waiting list will start at the top and work our way down. And some of the entities that are particularly in the Finger Lakes region and in the Capital region, both of which have already submitted more than enough applications to use up 6.3 million. But since I have not yet reviewed the applications, I don't know if any of them are award worthy at the moment, or if they are, how many are. But there's a good chance that the 6.365 million has already been used up in each of those 2 regions, which means that any of you in those 2 regions that have not yet submitted an application, really about your only hope is going to be tapping into that reserve balance. And if any other region does not fully utilize their 6.3, those amounts will be added to the 6.365 unreserved or reserved allocation. And they won't become available until about June 1st or later next year. And so if you can start doing the math by looking at the spreadsheet, which I have posted on the website, I'll show you that again shortly. That's how you keep track of, well, what are your chances of maybe getting an award? Some of the people that have participated in this in the past keep very close tabs on that because they actually intend to be some of the award winners on that supplemental list, that waiting list. So all this comes into play. It's all very important, and this would be a good time now to jump to the department's website. And let me go do that. Okay, I want to let me see if I can unmute everyone again. All right, I've unmuted you just to make sure. Could someone verify that you're now looking at the department's website?
Yes.
Anyone? Okay, great, great.
Yep.
This is how you find information for, excuse me? This is how you find information. I'm going to go ahead and mute you all again. You go to the department's website, it's important to know that the best way to navigate around is just this blue colored bar up top. And for the grant opportunity itself, you go to business development, you see funding opportunities, you click on that, and then what you would do is you just simply scroll down and you'll start seeing that there are opportunities. The one that's always listed at the top is the one that was most recently announced. So ours is not at the very top anymore. It's just a couple down. Probably in another week or month or a couple of months as this goes on, this will then fall off into a subsequent page. And so it may not be easy to scroll down and simply find it. If you need to, just go over to keywords and type in farmland protection, and then hit enter, and then it should pop up as probably one of those few that would show. But for right now, it's RFA 0393. My advice to you is to go ahead and do this on your own computer. Open this up, click on it, and then bookmark this page, because this will have a lot of the information, including here's the request for applications document. For those of you that haven't gotten into SFS, and start looking at the online application itself, or those of you that may be a participant, a stakeholder in a project, and you may not be the applicant, you may not be eligible to look at the things online, and so this would give you a pretty good idea of the information that you still need to be aware of. As you see here under the apply subheading, that talks about the webinar today and tomorrow. And this is after the recordings are done, this is where they'll be posted. So keep that in mind if you do want to go back and listen to this, or if you missed the next one, it would be an opportunity to listen to it by a link here. The application instructions document is another important one and will really help you as you sit at your computer online in SFS to fill out the application itself. I'm going to back out of this page. Now we're back to the department's homepage. Then you go over to the plant and natural resources, click on farmland protection. Scroll down, you get to the middle column, which is always about FPIG here. And of course, if you see this around 20 status of awards, whether you go to the page itself or just click on it directly, what you're going to want to do is, if I scroll back up, you'd come here and you would see it's over here. And if you're scrolling down, you also see the link here. So when you, this has been updated twice already. And hopefully it's going to reveal the most recent one I submitted yesterday. But there should be one showing 24 applications. There we go. Okay, and it is showing that. The date of the report will always be right about here at the top. And what's indicating is you see each of the 9 regions are listed across these, well, right now it's 3 pages. I'll just scroll back and forth. try not to make you too dizzy here, but you see that the 6.365 million, that's the amount that's allocated to each region. The two active regions, as I already indicated, is Finger Lakes, shown right here. Then scrolling down, the capital region has most recently kind of come into play. And what I wanted to focus on, I'll use Finger Lakes as the good example. I think you can tell by looking at these dollar amounts, the 6.365 million isn't going to last very long. Now, which ones of these, 16 will actually be initially awarded, that's yet to be determined because they're all under review right now. And I want you to realize that they are going to be listed in the order received. That's what's shown over here on this column. And I review them in that order. I don't begin this next one until I've completed the first one, and so on. So as I complete them, I will either make a determination that it's award worthy on the spot, or I will have assembled some comments and I will send it off to that vendor. That vendor, then the ball is back in their court. While they're showing up in the order that they submitted, they still don't have an award. So they're going to have to respond to my comments. When they respond back, I will take them in the order received. And so if I'm working my way down to these 16, I send off the first one. Let's just say there are comments with it. Well, then I'm not going to begin looking at their comments that they submit to me until here, number 17, if you will. So the order that I receive things is the order that I have to review them. And it's in that order that determines who gets what awards. And so the first one or two or three or four even don't necessarily mean they're going to be awarded, because if they require comments and it may take some time for them to get back to me, I may determine that the next two or three or four or five are, upon review, excellent and have no comments, and there'll be award determination on the spot, which means that a lower placed one may actually become the first awarded one. So keep in mind, until you start seeing the results in a subsequent posted status sheet, nobody really knows what the current status is of things until there's some revealing done. So because I've just come off of vacation, because of the timing of the announcement, this is the most current status. It's at least acknowledging that we've received thus far 24 applications. None of them have been fully reviewed yet. And as they do, I'll start posting those results here. So for those of you, particularly in other regions, right now, you know that the game is yours. If you're the first one in, and more importantly, you're the first to be determined to be a fully complete and acceptable application, then that's the one that will get awarded in that region. And so what you want to do is stay focused initially on how much does your project compare to 6.3 million, and how much does the other projects that are in play, or especially those that have been determined to be award worthy, how much is left of that 6.3? That's what's important initially for you to keep track of in your region. And then as we get closer to June 1st, you start realizing that, well, there's probably no money coming from the Capital Region or Finger Lakes to be added to a statewide pot. But if you scroll down, this is going to stay in place until at least that June 1st date. There's a guarantee that there's 6.365 million waiting for everyone. Now, my hunch is that we have a lot of prospects here from Finger Lakes and probably Capital Region that are going to begin populating in order of starting with position number 1 to however far it goes, that are going to be having the best shot at the 6.365 million. So for those of you that have not yet begun an application, whether you're in those two regions or elsewhere, you realize that you're probably going to have almost no shot realistically at money in that reserve list, or a less and less chance as time goes on. So it underscores my point, is that your best shot is at your own regional allocation. As we get closer to June 1st, you'll start to see that if we have some regions, and let's just say Long Island doesn't respond, well, then that means there's going to be another 6.3 or if they do respond, but not very many, then most of the 6.3 will likely become available and added to the 6.3 million. That's that unallocated reserve. I hope all that makes sense. And if you have questions or want to have a follow-up conversation with me, please just reach out. But these are the kinds of things that are the things to keep watchful eye on throughout the request for applications, because it gives you I think, a pretty realistic sense of what is your best shot within your region, as well as any chance of being on a statewide waiting list for that June 1st or thereafter date for the release of whatever available funds are left. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And again, just keep in mind that each report will be dated. So it'll give you a point of reference of if you've already seen that report, or is it a new one. There's not going to be any particular recurring time frame of when that gets updated. It gets updated as soon as I can, and that kind of depends on the pace of not only incoming applications, but also how many am I, making progress on reviewing and making award determinations on. So that'll be a frequent but unscheduled types of updates. Keep that in mind, please. Let me go back to the presentation. And once again, let me unmute you all. If you could just verify that you were looking back at the presentation again. Should be the allocation map.
Looks good, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And let me continue on here. When we award a project, what's the work that's going to have to be done? Well, there are basically 3 deliverables over the course of a 4-year contract. And the first one would be due within 6 months of the state approving the contract. Now let's back up and explain that. When we award a contract, and the earliest contracts will probably be awarded, at least I'm anticipating, in March. Probably starting sometime latter part of March. And so if that's our first wave of awards, then they would have a March some date, 2026 start date, and they would run for 4 years. However, no one has a contract at that moment. They just have an award letter. And so after we make that original initial wave of awards, we then put together what's called the procurement record, submit that to the Office of State Comptroller. Once they approve it, then I can begin building contracts. So however long it takes to do those, then you will be notified that a contract is now ready. It's been approved by the state. That is the date that the 6-month window is referring to. So let's just say that we award something on March 30th of 2026. Let's say that by time between the review of the procurement and approval of the procurement record, development of the contract, having everyone sign the contract, and the state approving the contract, let's say we're now looking at July, or maybe even later, but July of 2026. When I notify you that here's a copy of your approved contract, and let's say that's mid-July, then that's day 1 of this 6-month window. Now, if you don't submit the preliminary package in 6 months, we're not going to unplug the contract. We're not going to disqualify it. We're just saying is that you really need to be hitting the mark of 6 months if you hope to get done within 2 years from the state approval of the contract. And that really is our expectation of you, is to get done within 2 years. Because for that to happen, things will go along smoothly. The landowner, who is going to be waiting an awful long time, because keep in mind, their clock began ticking when you knocked on their door and see if they were interested, or if the roles were reversed and they came to visit you, that's really when their clock began ticking. It doesn't begin when the submission of the application, and it certainly doesn't begin until the contract gets approved. But what I'm trying to tell you, and this goes back to helping you trying to manage landowner expectations, it's really important that you relay to them that this timing and these expectations of the state on you, the applicant, and the awardee, because that, I think, gives them a real perspective of when are they going to get to the finish line and get that big check from you, and when are they actually going to convey the easement. So there's a lot of moving parts to get us to that end, and it all begins with submitting the preliminary package, which will typically be a title report and curative letters from your attorney that looks at the title report and says what kind of issues, if any, are there that need to be resolved. A mortgage is a great example. A mortgage either has to be paid off, that's highly unlikely. So what will happen is the landowner has to go and talk to their mortgage holder and see how much of the proceeds of the sale of the easement do they want. They may want it all. They may want only a portion of it to satisfy financially their requirements, because after all, they're holding a lien on that person's property. And so if the person were to go default on that mortgage, they'd want to sell the farm and get their money back. They're not going to want to sell a farm with an easement on it unless they've agreed to do so. And that's where subordination comes in. And for that mortgage holder to give that landowner a subordination, they may need to take some or even all of the proceeds, depending on how much in debt they are with that mortgage. So those are the important things to keep in mind, but all this is the significance of the title report and the curatives. The curatives do not have to be completed when you submit this. We're just saying is that your attorney has to have thought through what it needs to get fixed, what needs to get addressed, and when. And most of these things often will not occur until closing of the real estate transaction that we're funding. And that might be, 2 years from now. So that's fine, but you do have to give us indication of when it's going to occur, as well as what needs to be addressed. Our attorneys will look at that and see is, okay, does it look like it's addressed everything? So our counsel's office will review that. I will review the easement document, which again, yes, you will provide an updated version of the one you submitted in the application, because now certainly you would have determined a few more policy content items. For example, you may not have determined, kind of the subdivision clause in the initial submission. Certainly by now you need to do that. And with our model easement, for example, if you take the 87.5% cost share rate, you have 3 options. And so you have to determine one by the time you submit the preliminary package. That's really the kinds of things that we're talking about. So there may be a change. It might be minimal changes to the easement document, but there probably will be some from the time it was submitted in the application. And that's really to give me an idea of where we headed as a project. What's the content of this document? So these are the 2 things that will always be submitted in a preliminary package, hopefully within that or around that 6-month mark. If at any time the landowner, and I would imagine it's coming from the landowner, wants to see a change in the site plan, a site plan, again, remember, was submitted as part of the application. When we award the project, that means that we were okay with the site plan. So if the landowner wants to make any change, you've got to bring us into that discussion. And we want to know what the proposed change is. What does it look like? And so if a change is being proposed, the best time to submit that to us would be part of the preliminary package. And so the site plan needs to be revised and whatever it's going to address. And then both the awardee entity and the landowner must sign it. And the reason for those signatures is to indicate to the department that you 2 are in concurrence of whatever it is being proposed now. I need that assurance that the landowner is on board, and or I need the assurance that you guys are on board as the easement holder. So that's the significance. But again, the site plan would only be submitted if there's a change. Otherwise, it's just the first 2 items. So under an awarded project, if all things are going well, 6 months in, we see a preliminary package. We review it. We determine everything's acceptable. We issue the interim payment number 1, which is actually the second payment. The advance payment occurs when the state approves the original contract. So about a year after we send you that second payment, we would expect the project file then to be submitted. The project file is the heavy lift of the contract deliverables, and it's the second of three contract deliverables. And when you add up the months, now we're looking at about a year and a half into the project is when we would anticipate you'd be submitting it for our review. And it would include probably most, if not all of these documents, and some of the documents are indicated, you know, when are they required. But we're not going to get into a lot of detail about this. It's really to give you an idea of kind of what's the work involved. And this is clearly the heavy lifting. You're going to have an appraisal. You're going to have an updated title report. You're going to have an updated easement. You're going to have a survey. You know, these types of things. You're also going to have a form that gives an update as to the current status of a conservation plan. Most farmers that, or most landowners that are farmers probably have a conservation plan already. It's not something unusual. For those of you that might be in different parts of the state, like, you know, the really the lower Hudson Valley is a good example. A lot of times landowners of agricultural lands aren't farmers. You know, they're people of means who bought the property because they love the landscape. But if they want to get paid for an easement through our program, and they're not farmers, then the land is going to have to be farmed by somebody, and that somebody is the one who's going to be getting a conservation plan prepared that's going to benefit the landowner, because the easement requires that there is a conservation plan on that property. And if that landowner is not a farmer, they're not going to understand what a conservation plan is or what the provisions are. So they're going to have to rely on working with their farmers that they're leasing to. And so that's where sometimes that can get complicated. And it begins at the application phase, because you're going to have indication of, is there any conservation plan at the time of application? And then this is really more of a documentation that it has been completed. So the project file again comes in with these components about a year and a half later. After we review that, then the good news is, the exciting news, we approve the interim payment number 2. Interim payment number 2 is what I refer to as the balloon payment. That's the payment that really enables you to go to closing, because virtually all of that money is what's going to go to the landowner to pay them for the purchase or the sale of the conservation easement to you. About 4 months after we send you that payment, we're going to be anticipating that you delivered back to us a final report. And the final report includes these items, and it really would prove that the transaction occurred. So it would be a copy of the recorded easement, a copy of the title insurance policy that you'd have to buy, those kinds of things. And then if you had some additional add-on things like the soil health assessment, if you wish to do that, you can add that to any project. As I mentioned here, I'll get into that a little bit more tomorrow. And then really the other thing is showing us the financials. This is the only time that you're going to deliver financial information to us, and it comes really after the fact. So we're taking a great leap of faith with you all, that you have been spending the money appropriately and as was intended. And so that's what the review is, and we put that intentionally off to the end because we're confident that everyone knows, you know, why we're giving you the money and what you're going to use it for. So this is really where the accounting is done in just reconciling where the money went. And it would be the money that we provided as well as whatever match that you said you were going to deliver. This would be an opportunity then for you to prove that you did deliver it and you spent it appropriately according to the budget that we approved way back in the application. So that's kind of the process should you be awarded. Again, there's 3 deliverables: the preliminary package, so at about the 6-month mark after the contract has been approved, the project file at about 18-month mark, and then this would be you know, sometime 4 months after we send you that payment, that balloon payment. And so we anticipate that if you hit those time marks, that by the time we approve this final report, we're probably at about the 2-year mark after the contract has been approved. And if need be, maybe a little bit longer. But I think, we believe that a 2-year window is very achievable. We do have a number of entities that successfully complete these in less than 2 years. That's great. Landowner, of course, loves that. We've had other entities that have taken much longer than 4 years and even required a contract approval amendment, excuse me, to extend. That's less good because the landowner is the one that's really being seeing the hardship of that, because they probably have made plans for the money, and they probably are questioning the good faith of everyone, including the state, for what they thought they were getting into. So while we will hang with you all to get to however long it takes, the idea is that 2 years is the mark you should all be shooting for, and hope that you can address it. This is a summary table taken out of the RFA, which basically just, again, summarizes these deliverables, which is really in the middle column, and then, what constitutes each of those 4 payments. The advance payment, let me zoom in on this a little bit. Bear with me here. Hit the wrong button. Okay, the advance payment, the components of an advance payment is identical to all contracts. The dollar amount obviously varies because of the values of things, but everyone gets a $1,500 stipend to obtain a title report, and that doesn't matter if it's a 1 easement or 8 easement project. Doesn't matter if it's 1,000 acres or 35 acres. It's the same stipend amount, because you figure that's enough to probably cover almost any title report cost. And then whatever it is you budgeted of state funds towards project partners time, and whatever it is you budgeted state contribution towards your legal fees. Those 3 things go into that advance payment. To give you some ballpark, it's often $5,000 to $8,000 or $9,000, almost regardless of the size of the project. That's kind of this average payment, a typical advance payment. We issue that just as soon as we are told that the that the Office of State Comptroller has approved the contract. We try and get that payment out as soon as possible. And then moving on, after you receive that, oftentimes, and we have no expectation otherwise, oftentimes the entity will begin work once they have received that payment, and that's fair. And we certainly have no expectation that anyone will be advancing their own funds to do work prior to that. But a number of entities, particularly that have gotten awards over the years and are quite confident that FPIG will continue to deliver contracts, because we have never not awarded a contract that we otherwise made an award to an entity for. They have decided to take the risk of saying, well, we believe we're going to get an advance payment, so we'll begin the work with our own money. We'll just spend the $1,500 to get a title report. We have our own staff time, they're being paid generally. So, we're going to be doing our work, and then we'll be advancing funds to our attorneys to do the review of that title report and so on. For those that do that, we will, of course, accept a preliminary package submitted by them to us even before a contract is approved. We will review it in the order that we get it. We will not sit on it, at least I won't sit on it. Our counsel's office has been a little bit on, they'll wait till the contract is approved in the last round. I don't know if that's going to continue. I can't speak for them, but I will always review things as they come in the order that I get them. So once we approve the preliminary package again, then we make that interim payment number 1. And that is based on these components. And with an interim payment 1, as you can see, then you would have received 100% of the budgeted amount of state contribution towards your staff time, as well as legal fees. The reason we do that really up front, and again, there's 4 total payments. The reason we give you all that money for those 2 folks or groups of people is because we realize that sometimes you may make some discoveries that it's going to eat up more staff time than you anticipated. So we want to enable you to have those resources should those kind of problems come up. That is our intent anyway. So if we get moving on after the initial interim payment number 1 is made, then you do the heavy lifting, you submit that project file, we review it, we then approve it, and we then send you that balloon payment. Again, really the interim payment 2 is the money that's going exclusively to the landowner. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. But to give you another kind of perspective, it's probably going to be easily 85% of the total award. Oftentimes it's about that amount that's going into that. So again, that enables you to go to closing. You go to closing, you then start putting together the final report. You submit that. After we review everything, the remainder of the award is simply the easement stewardship fee contribution and the conservation easement defense liability insurance. And the latter item there is only relevant to land trusts. No one else can participate in the program. It's called terra firma, and it's really associated with through the an element of Land Trust Alliance. They created an insurance program. And so again, if you're a municipality, county, whatever, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. So your easement stewardship fee would be the remaining part that we would owe you. So upon receipt of that, then the project is closed out and the contract is closed out. And a successful project, now also have to emphasize. So let me go back to the full page. Let me move on to this. And speaking of the payments, the way I administer things is that as you start earning these payments, I will prepare and submit back to you the documents that are mentioned on this page. And I'm going to jump to the last page of this presentation. I'm not going to zoom in because we don't really need to get into these details, but I'll provide to every vendor as you earn these payments, these 2 documents. One is the form on the left, the submission form. I'll have it pre-filled out for you. I will have the claim on the right pre-filled out for you. The thing that you need to do is have some authorized representative of your organization sign it and date it. That's right about in the middle of the form. And then you attach these 2 documents as separate attachments to an email that you then send to the BSC, the Business Service Center of the State of New York. When I send you this information, I'll give you that contact information and some instructions. Then you simply send these off to them, and then it may take, believe it or not, up to 2 months for the payment to actually arrive in your financial account. Oftentimes it takes far less than that, but they do reserve the right, the BSC for 30 days and OSC for 30 days, for 60 total potentially from the time that you submit it to the BSC. Oftentimes we see things go much faster than that. Usually payments are getting back to people, I think more often than not, within a month or about a month, but things do vary from time to time. So that is the payment process and how we handle that. Like I said, I stay on top of that. I submit those things to you as we go. Let me jump back to where we were. So that's the payment process. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy documents, the policy guidance. I think it's important for all of you to have a perspective on, kind of what the department's expectations are, what the department's intent is, and our desire for how some of these agricultural conservation easements will look, what we're trying to achieve by offering a program like FPIG. All of these are important documents, so I would encourage you to peruse them all if you haven't already. But the key ones really are the second one, the land plan. That's very, very important. It's a multiple page document which really gets into a lot of principles. I want to underscore to you all that you will not find a single black and white answer in that document. Instead, what you will find are the principles of how we evaluate a site plan. And that's what I hope you'll come to understand by reading through that. And then as you draft your site plan, kind of think about this document or read through it again and then take a look at your site plan. Because things like viability of the operation, how is that really being exhibited on the site plan? What are kind of off-site, abutting landowner land uses, I should say, that may not be really appropriate neighbors, frankly, for if you're proposing, and I underscore this, not an existing farmstead, but if you're proposing a farmstead, which would likely be where the landowner is going to live, if they're moving to this property or they've just acquired and haven't built anything yet, you're proposing a farmstead where they might live, where they might put all the infrastructure, the barn and other things. They might do other types of businesses within this building envelope, and you park this 10 maybe 15 acre site of lots of activity directly across the road from 3 home sites. That may not be very wise. And while it is your property, you can do what you want. Please remember you're inviting us to the party to invest in this property. And we also have, through our commissioner and through our statute, 25AA again of Ag and Markets Law, our commissioner has the statutory authority to direct a town to immediately stop enforcing what we believe to be an unreasonable restriction against farming, and if the property is enrolled in an agricultural district. Now, with that kind of authority, we don't take that lightly, and so we're not going to invest in a property that you're choosing to create a potential problem, frankly, for us down the road of having to defend some future farmer, maybe not even you, or you're the farmer that you're working with, I should say. And so we're going to scrutinize the site plan for those types of issues. And so we'd rather have that kind of lots of activity that might be conflicting land uses with a neighbor to have it moved somewhere else on the property. Again, if that's possible and if that's appropriate. Those are the kinds of challenges that, is really what's important about considering a site plan, or what's referred to as a land plan here. So that, of all these documents, I would say I think that's probably the most important one to take a look at and think about in developing the site plan for your projects. The model easement, you can use it for any cost share rate, but you must use it for the 87.5%. If you are getting in the situation where it's a must use for you, then I would encourage you to read through the document. Your organization needs to embrace the fact that this is the content that you are going to forever enforce and defend. And if you find any reason why you're not comfortable with that, then obviously you need to look at a different cost share rate and then not go that approach. Again, these are the kinds of serious considerations we really do expect everyone to make. I believe wholeheartedly that our model easement is the most the most supportive of any farmer landowner of any easement that I've seen in my 21 years here. Now that doesn't necessarily resonate with an easement holder. You may feel that you need to have some additional restrictions. And so if that's the case, then I would encourage you to take a look at the 75% cost share rate. But you need to keep the landowner made aware of why are you making that decision when they could have potentially gotten 87.5% of a contribution. So those are the kinds of things that I think, again, you really need to work through with the landowner. I'm happy to participate as a from the state's perspective about our view on things, if that would help. But those are the things I think are really important to think about at the time of application, because they're certainly going to underscore those expectations the landowner has throughout the process. There's also a guidance document about appraisals. Probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that the appraisal, if a PPR, a preemptive purchase right, is going to be included, that must be addressed within the report, separate and apart from really what's the development potential of the property, because we need to see that the appraiser has independently and individually, or separately, in other words, made the value associated with those two components. And it's likely that an appraisal including PPR will be more costly than an appraisal without PPR. Again, we need to see that the appraisal has addressed PPR if that's going to be a component of the project within the report. so we can see, kind of what that cost is. Because that goes back to, again, the state contribution. If we see that the cost of PPR is more than $250,000, then, we're going to cap our contribution at 250, which means then you must go find someone to pay for the difference of whatever their balance of that cost of the PPR is, if you're doing the up to 75% cost share. So those are the kinds of things to keep in mind about why they're important. If you're also doing PPR, then you need to look at the qualified farmer definition. You must insert that whenever state money is being used towards PPR. There's no negotiation about that. If you decide to do PPR and you're not asking for state funding, then obviously you can use whatever definition of qualified farmer you'd like. Now what I'd like to do is move into looking at some of the individual bid event applicant questions and have you be aware of the companion document when you're sitting at your computer on SFS and responding to the online questions, that you open up the SFS application submission instructions document. It's a companion document for this round of round 20 FPIG. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just take a break, short break here, and to see if anyone has any questions about all the material that we've gotten through. Let me unmute you all. Feel free to ask any question if you have one right now. I see a long list of people, so the good news to me is you haven't all left. So if you do have any questions, feel free to ask. No one's got anything. Okay. I'm going to leave it so that you can unmute yourself if you do have questions as we continue on. But now what I'd like to do is get into some of these questions. And again, this next portion, this final portion, is going to be much like what all of tomorrow's presentation will be. We'll really kind of get into the weeds about looking at the individual 11 categories and how some of the questions that are important about some of those aspects. For right now, though, I think if we look at this, is that, and this is important nuance that's unique to this round, so please pay particular attention. I've decided that we really want to see in an application, since no survey has been done, we want you to base it on publicly available data. So your total number of acres should be based on whatever the tax map parcel maps are saying. Those are typically provided at the county level, or a town identifies parcel numbers, whatever. And I'll quickly acknowledge to all of you, I'm well aware that those acreages are often way off, they're poor. But my point is they're consistently available to everyone, and it's a point of reference. So if we award a project and it says it's 150 acres, and you do a survey and it's 115, and there's no harm, no foul, it's a 115 acre project. And so, we're going to move on from that standpoint. And if it goes the other way, we thought we awarded, 150 and it's actually 175. Well, the state's going to jump for joy. We got more acreage out of it, but it's really not going to fundamentally change anything. However, keep in mind that if the acres really do fall below what was minimally required, we may have a real serious problem. And yet at the same time, we don't want to be basing an acreage on anything other than its publicly available data, because there really wouldn't be a leg for anyone to stand on if they were saying, well, I know that I have X number of acres. Well, really, how would you know that if you don't have a survey? And so if you want to submit that, then please base it on a tax map parcel. If you do have a survey, for whatever reason, the farmer has, the landowner has recently or relatively recently surveyed the property, and coincidentally, that entire property will be what's going to be protected. In other words, you do have a legal survey, then by all means, base the acreage on that. and we'll be happy to hang our hat on that. I just don't want anyone doing an estimate by the seat of the pants, because there's nothing defensible about that. So said enough about that, but we also don't want you to rely on GIS. GIS is a great tool, but unless GIS is using tax map parcels or is using surveyed acreage, then it's coming up with a different way of looking at it. And that's by, doing estimates of area based on the line segments that you drew, which may or not be perfectly accurate with the actual boundaries of the property, which again is why we want to go back to tax map parcels and or a legal survey. So please make sure that that's the basis of it. Otherwise, we may have problems down the road if we discover that they're not. The numbers initially weren't based on either one of those two sources. The question number 41, had enough conversations with a number of folks over the last several rounds that I really want to underscore this again, is that please understand that with an RFA, there's eligibility criteria. And with an RFA, I am the sole person who's going to make a determination if the application is award worthy. The reason why I've been given the keys to $67 million, it's because we've laid everything out. And why I want to underscore with question number 41 about the letter from a planning official is that I will not accept a letter that is written that is purely speculation. I deeply respect the opinion of a local planning official that they think that the subject property is ripe for development. I don't care, is what I'm trying to say. I need the local planning official to provide some factual information or at least anecdotal data information, something like sales on Zillow or something that's going on, some indication that's factually based, that was an indication of why this subject parcel is probably up for development potential. I can't base it on speculation. And I just can't emphasize that point enough. It's got to be about some kind of information. Now, and unless someone can help me understand why it's not readily available, I think any planning official, whether at the town or at the county, should have information about the number of subdivision proposals being made. When someone wants to subdivide 150 acres into 70 and 30 and 20 and something, or whatever it adds up to, that they have to make a request for that for consideration. And or if they have otherwise done something to number of sales of properties, that have happened. If there is a rural subdivision being proposed, residential subdivision, then use that as information. But what I'm saying is it's actual information. Even if it hasn't been fully been realized, at least it's been proposed. That's the kind of stuff that has to be put together and represented in that letter from a planning official. Now, before, when we did RFPs, we would let anyone submit whatever information they wanted, and then we left it up to our reviewers to determine, was it convincing? With an RFA, I don't really have that luxury because we want to make this criteria based. And so that's why this is actually a little bit more of an emphasis by content, but it needs to come from a local planning official. And again, I will accept any letter from any county planning official. I will accept any letter from any municipal, town, local planning official. But I have rejected a couple of letters and have pushed back a number of letters that said, we need to have some additional data or details, something factual added to it. In most cases, then the subsequent one we did accept. But that's why I'm calling attention to this, is that it simply cannot accept something that's speculative. I also want to reemphasize about the site plan. A number of folks have gotten a little too short on details. And so every site plan must contain the three highlighted elements: a context map, a detail map, and a narrative. And so that any site plan would be no less than 3 pages long. And a context map, and again, I'm going to be less concerned about the page size that you use because everything is going to be digital. But at 11 by 17, oftentimes, there's a little bit more resolution, there's a little bit more detail being revealed. But regardless of it's 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17, there needs to be a context map. And the context map needs to show enough of the landscape beyond the borders of the land to be protected to give us some sense of where does this sit in the world? Is it out in the rural landscape? Is it next to a village? Somewhere in between. What is are there other farms surrounding the farm to be protected? Are there other types of land uses, even if they are rural, occurring? Those kinds of things. So give us enough opportunity to see what the landscape looks like. Any exclusion that is being proposed, in other words, land owned by the participating landowners that they're choosing not to protect in this project, it must be revealed. And whether it's embedded in the property to be protected, if it's adjoining, if it's nearby, it's got to be revealed. Now, if it does not show up on the context map, then at least acknowledge that then on the narrative page that there is other land. It's just not, visible. Maybe it's in another town in the same county or something. Whatever the case is, at least acknowledge that. We won't necessarily have to see everything, but if something is abutting, if it's embedded, if it's adjoining, certainly then it must be revealed. The detail map, you need to have one for every easement. If you choose to have agricultural units, then my advice would be have a detail map for each agricultural unit. If that term does not mean anything to you, or if you don't use agricultural units, don't worry about it. Then just focus on having a detail map for each easement. Now, if you have one easement, and presumably it's something less than 500 or 1,000 acres, then that'll be just fine. But if you have multiple easements, please do not put them all in one detail map. Separate them out. And that's because, again, we want to see some real resolution. We want to see what's going on in the landscape within the area to be protected, especially if you start having different types of use areas, farmstead, a rural enterprise, limited compatible enterprise area, or resource protection area. We want to be able to see some things. And never, ever on a detail map do you use shading or cross-hatching. I'm sorry, do not use any shading. Or cross-hatching. What we really want to see is the underlying, landscape. What is the aerial photo really revealing? You can use those types of things on the context map, no problem. The narrative page, and this is one where I'm going to be more of a stickler about, there needs to be one for every detail map. If you have one detail map, there should be one narrative page. If you have 3 detail maps, there should be 3 narrative pages. And we also really want to make sure you address all the list of bulleted items that are here. There's a reason why we're asking for the information, so we can make some assessments of viability and some other concerns if they appear to us or not. And the only way for that to happen, since we're never going to do a site visit of any of these properties, is for you to present that information to us. So please take it to heart, make sure that these 3 components are in each site plan. And for the narrative page, please do your best to address each of the bullets. Now, in some cases, some of the bullets won't be relevant. Maybe the only use area is farm area. Well, if that's the case, you just designate it once and that's it. Moving on to the financial worksheet. Just want to say that if you are doing a PPR, a preemptive purchase right, then it goes in this blank up here, and I'll show you in a moment for each of the 3 cost share rates where that needs to go in. If you're not going to do a PPR, then don't worry about it. This simply stays blank, and you just focus on all the other cells to fill something in on. But with a PPR in mind, what I'd like to do now is walk through fairly quickly for each of the 3 cost share rates, the financial worksheets. So what I want to do is go here, and if someone could just unmute again and just let me know, are you seeing a financial worksheet? It's an Excel spreadsheet with multiple colors. Anyone?
Yeah, so I can see it. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I pre-filled this out because I don't want to go through a whole lot of time with this, but what I wanted to say is that what I've intentionally left blank right now is the state contribution towards really the purchase price of the easement. And so my best advice is that you start at the top of this financial worksheet and you work your way down, particularly the far left column from top to bottom. That's how, in my opinion, you should always fill these out. Because in doing so, what it really helps you do is then it gives you an opportunity then to think about how do you want to spend the state's money that you're asking for? Where do you want to put it? And obviously you should try to, make the landowner whole so that they have no out-of-pocket expenses. And in this case, I'm intentionally showing an out-of-pocket expense to the landowner that's associated with the fees, the easement stewardship fee. And why I'm doing that is because I recognize, and I want you to know this for what it's worth, is that we do think a $10,000 per easement contribution towards easement stewardship is pretty small. And it's been that way for many, many years. But it's one of those things that if you feel strongly, if you feel that you need to have more than 10,000 per easement, then that's something you'll need to have a chat with the landowner about. And this is reflecting that they've decided it's 22,000 that they need. And because the state is capped at 10,000, they're going to ask the landowner to make up the difference. So $12,000 cash contribution from the landowner. That's why it shows up here. So my point is, as you go through these other estimated costs for all of these, then really think about, well, my suggestion is whatever the number is in the left column, unless there's a cap on it from the state, then put the same number in the right-hand column, the state contribution. So then you start coming up with an amount. So if your total project cost is just over 2 million, and you've come up with $214,640 in transaction costs that the state will cover to the maximum extent possible, then what that leaves is the balance. And what would make up 87.5% total contribution that would then also illustrate how much is the state contributing towards the purchase price of the easement. Well, if we go to the next one then, and if someone could let me know, hopefully you're seeing the one with all the blue arrows on it.
Yes.
Thank you. Then really what this is trying to show you, hopefully in a not too complicated form, is that, how do you derive this number and what are the considerations? Well, I've parked the cell, I parked a cursor, I should say, on this cell. And so this is the rather convoluted formula, which I'm happy to share with anyone. We provide you a financial worksheet. We don't know who's going to do what, if there's going to be, different aspects done, or if they're going to do a PPR. So we don't provide two versions of this, one PPR and one not, because it kind of depends on how you decide you want to spend state money and what the the landowner contribution in cash must be for your particular project. So instead, what I wanted to do is to show you is that this can be a fairly convoluted looking calculation or formula here in the cell, but really what's driving it is that if you again fill in this at 100% of whatever the estimate costs are, keep in mind that this one has a cap on it, which is why we stop at 10,000. If the landowner is going to make up the difference, then okay, then everything else then should be at the state contribution. Then what would 87.5% be of the 2,041, 2,041,000? However, you have to go up and look, and then when you fill out the value of the PPR, whenever you're entering a number that's bigger than 250,000, hopefully you've remembered the state stops at 250,000. So that's a cap. So that's why this is showing that this amount needs to reflect only 250,000 states contributing. So that's why the 250 is being subtracted from this. And then you look at the other amounts, that it's acknowledging this difference down here. So then with those adjustments, you take 87.5% of what otherwise would have been this amount, and then you subtract off what you've contributed state dollars towards the transaction costs. So that's the basis for this formula, and that reveals to you that this particular project could ask for up to $1,719,060, and that is not 87.5% of total project costs, but it's instead 84.2. And the real reason why it doesn't meet 87.5 is because of the estimated cost of PPR. It's bigger than 250,000. If the number in blue up here had been $250,000 or less, then this would have worked out to pretty much 87.5, keeping in mind that the stewardship cost was higher than 10,000. And that would have been, $12,000 difference at versus 2 million total isn't very significant at a percentage. But does anyone not follow me? Maybe I'll ask it that way, because I think what it'll do is to suggest that maybe you individually follow up with me and we can kind of work through this. But I'm saying is that usually the mystery is what goes in here when you have a couple of outliers that are exceeding our caps on individual transaction costs. And that's the thing to be mindful of. So when you add everything up, what you're looking for is the auto math check. This should never be anything other than 100.0%. If it says 99.9, it's wrong. If it says 100.1%, it's wrong. If you look into the far right column, I'm going to highlight it here. And if you see any numbers that show up within parentheses, meaning it's a negative number, it's wrong. And so those are the things to look for. If you do not have anything in parentheses, if you do not have any other negative numbers anywhere else, and this adds up to 100%, 100.0%, then it's very likely that this thing has been filled out correctly. Whether or not it reveals 87.5%, even if that's the cost share rate you're asking for. And those would be the only ways that you'd be avoiding or not getting the full 87.5. Now, keep in mind that this is an exception. Like I said, if you're not asking for the full max, and we're a little over half of what you could ask for, and yet we're still have some internal reasons why the state's not going to be providing 87.5% of total. But it's because of that cost of PPR principally. Well, let me jump to the next one, which this is the up to 75%. And so it would be the same approach. You fill it from the top, go down the left-hand column. Again, I'm showing the same stewardship amounts, 22,000, states capped at 10,000. We go back up and everything else is, whatever's ever entered in the estimated cost shows up to the buck under state contribution for everything else. We're still showing the same numbers. So the mystery is then what about this? Well, the same thing is applying with the value of preemptive purchase right, a little bit of that difference because of stewardship, but it's also because of the cost share rate. This is one we're asking up to 75%. So now let me click on kind of the results one. And again, if someone could verify you're looking at the blue arrows.
Yes.
Thank you. Again, it's the same ones principally contributing to this number, but then we have this other thing coming back, and that's showing that, okay, when you're selected the up to 75% of state cost share, then you have an obligation to provide a cash contribution. And in this case, they happen to be contributing $70,000 towards the purchase price of the easement, way above the $5,000 necessary. So that's not a problem. But the issue is that the stipulation when you go with 75% cost share rate with the PPR, you must make the landowner whole. And in this case, since PPR costs $315,000, the state has a cap of $250,000. That's an additional $65,000 that you're going to have to come up with from some non-state, non-federal source to pay for. And you can't force the landowner to make a bargain sale donation of that $65,000. We're not going to let you do that because PPR is a very important provision. We feel strongly that they should be made whole on that component. And so this text box down here is revealing the sources of local match. In the one case, they're providing $5,000 towards the purchase price, and $65,000 towards the PPR, and that's why this shows $70,000. So it's the $5,000 towards the purchase price and $65,000 towards PPR, which again are actually both part of the purchase price, but the different components. And why there's a requirement of $65,000 is because $315,000 is obviously exceeding the 250 cap. So that would be an additional nuance that you'd have to keep in mind when figuring out what's the state contribution if you've selected that you want to go with the 75% cost share rate and you know that you're going to be doing PPR. And again, if this number up here were $250,000 or less, then the $65,000 issue goes away and it would be back to a $5,000 contribution. So let me get back to the presentation. And if someone could verify, we're now looking at the financial worksheet with the yellow footnotes.
Yes.
Anyone? Okay, thank you. We're almost done, folks. So that is the financial worksheet. I think what I'll do now, grab a glass of milk, refresh yourself, and then let's open it up to questions. Anyone have any questions? Well, then does everyone feel like it's hopeless? Just so I know. No, now you have me wondering if anyone's still with me. Okay, I see a lot of people here.
Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome. Does anyone have any questions? Seriously, I'm happy to address any or help you find a location in the RFA to maybe what the question is that you have in mind. Otherwise, please think about joining me tomorrow or listening to that recording of that one tomorrow, and then submit any questions, and please try to do so by next Monday, the 12th. We will take questions anytime thereafter, and depending on what those questions are, we may be then adding supplemental answers. Now, keep in mind that if I get no questions, we will not have any Q&A posted. So if you don't see a Q&A and you're wondering if there is one, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to let you know that. But we have not had a Q&A last round, and this round is identical to the last round with a couple of very minor things. Well, one minor thing. Everyone now must submit a boundary survey, survey of the property. Almost everyone has been doing so throughout the history of the program, so it's really not much of a change. We've put it back to a requirement. Years ago, we had it as a requirement, then we took it off as a requirement, and only if needed for title issues, but everyone's doing it, and it just makes more sense to have everyone do it, and we do provide the cost share for it. So that is a requirement as part of the project file. The other one, of course, is that we're now allowing it to go up to $3 million per project, and that's very significant. But otherwise, there's really a very little difference between this and the last offering. If there are some other nuances, and there are just a few, those will be more apparent in tomorrow's presentation.
Dave, Jen Wong here. I don't know if you saw the hand raise or not.
Oh, I did not. Sorry.
A quick question, really more about dates and timing. We had some farms that participated in the appraisals on ag lands grant program about 2 years ago now. So we had recommendations from County Ag Board letters and Soil and Water Conservation District Tier 2 assessments that were done. Those, as I said, those are probably now about 2 years, 24 to 28 months old in terms of the dates on those. Are those still valid at this point, or are you going to want to see those updated, redated?
Well, it sounds like you have two questions, one about appraisals and the other one about an appraisal document, and then another one about that AIM verification form.
One would be about, so these were not so much about appraisals, but about the documents that were prepared as part of that grant process and that are also required here, and wondering for letters from county ag boards and for Soil and Water Conservation District Tier 2 assessments, if there is an expiration date on those essentially.
Well, an endorsement letter, if one were required from the land trust grants, that's irrelevant to FPIG. You'd have to get a endorsement letter for FPIG. That's always the case.
Okay.
And again, as a land trust, you'd have to get an endorsement letter from the county as well as whatever town or towns the farm is located in. As far as the AIM verification form, I believe it says at the top of the form that, it's got to be within 3 years.
3 years. Okay.
So, even if you're at 28 months and you hit submit, you're good.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else have any questions? Did the showing you the status and talking about kind of paying attention to where the money is going in the different regions? Did anyone have any question on that? Was everyone able to follow that? Why we have a bashful group. Well, with that then, I'm going to say good luck to everyone. I look forward to seeing more applications. For those of you that have already submitted them, please bear with me. I've been on vacation. I will work through those individually in the order that they were received. And then I'll start getting out any follow-up with you individually about those. And for those that have not yet submitted one, but know that you are, then like I said, please just pay attention to what's going on in your particular region. And if you feel like, the opportunity is kind of passing you by, then your next shot is pay attention to as we start making award determinations and we start developing a statewide waiting list, and it will show up in that spreadsheet as a waiting list. Start just doing the math and compare that initially with the 6.365 million. And then as we get closer to June, be paying attention to the unawarded balances in any of the other regions. And if you're a gambling person, then saying, well, then how much of those individual balances do you think may end up being added to that unallocated 6.3 reserve? Because if you take that sum, whatever you come up with, and compare with the waiting list, that would be your best way of judging whether or not you should submit another application. Hope that makes sense. Folks, good luck. And again, as you start developing applications, if you have a site plan, whether maybe it's before you want to submit an application, if you have a local plan, you're wondering, is it acceptable or whatever, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to work with you in helping make those assessments. If you feel like, well, look, it doesn't matter if we do it before or after it's going to get done, then that's fine too. Submit it as part of the application. We'll see, where things fall. But I do want you to know that the whole point of the RFA is to be a very open process, and you're all welcome to reach out with whatever kind of queries that you want, and happy to take and make the time for that to happen. Also, if any of you have funding sources you want to explore, or if any of you have worked or may end up working with what are called impact investors or social investors who may be looking at, and they may have already selected a farm, they may have already selected, usually often it's a new and beginning farmer to work with. That social investor may be very interested in selling an easement to you, your organization. And that's where our FPIG funds can come into play, because it would be part of their exit strategy. Since they acquired the property, they're looking to sell it to that new and beginning farmer. That new and beginning farmer is not going to have the resources to pay him the full value. And so oftentimes they may look at doing an easement while they own it before selling it to the farmer to recoup some of that initial investment. So if any of that is a possibility with any of you, feel free to get the social, the impact investor on the phone with me. Happy to walk through some of the details so that they're more comfortable about figuring out if they want to do that or not. There's been a few of those projects that have happened over the course of the years. We're trying to emphasize more and more that this is really, I think, a very viable funding source for more of that to happen. And that may come into play if you're really thinking about trying to help new and beginning farmers get on the land. So just be thinking about those things as well. All right, that wraps it up then for me, folks. Good luck. Thank you all very much for joining us. And this will be recorded and posted probably at the end of the week. Thank you.